Okay, so I want to add a footnote to yesterday's discussion. Yesterday, the Rambam was talking about HaKadosh Baruch Hu saying that it'll harden Pharaoh's heart. And he said that a person can commit such crimes that one way in which he's punished is that he loses his ability to do tshuva. Baruch Hu takes away his free will so that he will not be able to do tshuva. I'm going to explain why that's not unjust. Let me explain why it doesn't contradict the purpose of creation, because everyone's access to tshuva is finite. The person's going to die anyway, so that no one is going to be cheated thereby by losing the opportunity to do tshuva. But we didn't explain why Kadosh Baruch Hu would do that. Why would that be the chosen punishment for the person, that he loses his free will and he's not able to do tshuva? Now, the Rambam gives more of the explanation of this, and the explanation carries with it some very deep implications. People commit various crimes, and various types of punishments are appropriate for various crimes. And the Rambam says that there are different types of punishments, and none of us knows for a particular person in detail why what he did should be punished one way or another. But we know that Kadosh Baruch Hu is just, and the punishment always fits the crime. Now he says, what would happen if a person commits a crime, and according to justice, the punishment for that crime is a certain event, and the person does tshuva? We have a rule. The rule is that tshuva prevents all punishment. As he puts it in the Mishnah Torah, tshuva tris b'fnei paranias. It's like a wall in face of punishment, which stops the punishment dead. Well, but suppose the punishment needs to be applied. Let's suppose that justice requires it, and all things considered, justice should be carried out. Well then, I'm putting this incautiously, and I'll correct it in a moment. Well then, so to speak, Kadosh Baruch Hu has no choice. The only way that he can ensure that justice will be done is to stop the person from doing tshuva. That would be the motivation for preventing him from doing tshuva. And this applies not only to Pharaoh, it applies later to verses that speak about the Jewish people failing. And Kadosh Baruch Hu says to the prophet, I've arranged it that these people won't do tshuva, or the prophet says to Kadosh Baruch Hu, you yourself prevented them from doing tshuva. Now, the reader at this point thinks, wait a minute, you're telling me the Creator had no choice? He was sort of stuck. He was pushed into a corner where he had to stop them from doing tshuva, because otherwise justice couldn't be carried out? Why not just let them do tshuva and punish them anyhow? Who said that tshuva is a wall against all punishment? Surely there's another way out here. Yeah.
Would it also be unjust in the same sort of a way to stop them from doing tshuva, where it doesn't help the problem? This is the same thing can be said for the Kadosh Baruch Hu stopping the person from doing tshuva.
I don't see why. Where is the injustice in stopping a person from doing tshuva? Why would that be unjust?
I'm assuming there should be a principle also that a person has free will to do tshuva. In the same sense that tshuva stops sin.
Well, assuming a principle doesn't get you that when you violate the principle it's unjust. Assuming a principle doesn't get you the consequence that when you violate the principle it's unjust. Let's say a person says that I've decided to give everyone a free present every morning. And then 2 years later he says, I've changed my mind, I'm not doing it anymore. Is it unjust that they don't get more free presents? Have they been victimized? Have they been cheated and not getting any more free presents? No, he had a principle of giving and now he's not giving anymore. The fact that you have a principle and you violate the principle or change the principle or give up the principle doesn't mean that it's unjust. So here, I think in what I'm telling you now is going to be in a certain sense the answer to the question. But if justice demands that because of the crime this should be the punishment, then failing to give the punishment is unjust. If the problem with giving the punishment is that tshuva might get in the way, and you have a principle of tshuva, so you say, okay, you have a principle of tshuva, but in this case, since justice wants the punishment to take place, don't operate with that principle. The fact that you don't operate with the principle doesn't mean that the person is being victimized and denied something that he deserves and has by right. It's just there was a principle of giving it to him, and now it doesn't give it to him anymore. And as I said yesterday, even more so, what happens when you die? Is that unjust because you lose free will? And you lose it permanently. Somehow, or sleep. What do you mean? You created me in such a way that I fall asleep. And when I'm asleep, I can't exercise free will. Is that unjust that you created me that I fall asleep and I can't exercise free will? The principle of free will tolerates interruptions, exceptions, and an end. So it wouldn't be unjust in that sense. But once you ask the question, why not do it that way? Who says that because Baruch Hu's back is to the wall, that he must stop him from doing tshuva? The answer is very simple, because Kodesh Baruch Hu decided that tshuva should be the top. That tshuva should be the most important factor. That tshuva should run the entire outcome. So it's not as if he's stopped by a force beyond his control. He made a decision. He didn't have to set up the world that way. He set it up that tshuva is the top. Once he set it up that tshuva is the top, then in order to maintain his decision that tshuva should be the top, and also engineer that justice should apply, then he's going to have to stop the person from doing tshuva. Otherwise, he's going to end up not getting what he wants. His will is not going to be carried out. So, and this is a general rule when people use loosely the vocabulary, because Baruch Hu had to do this. What they really mean is, given that he made a decision that things should work in such and such a way, this is the only way to operate, to make it work in that way. But not that he was stopped by something outside of himself and bigger than himself that forced him to do things one way rather than another. It's a question of his own decision to run things that way. It's his own management procedure, so to speak. So, now, as I said a moment ago, this idea of, that means that tshuva is, the very fact that he takes away tshuva in order to protect the punishment that justice requires, means that tshuva would have stopped it. That's why he has to stop the person from doing tshuva, because otherwise tshuva would have stopped the punishment. And then it's very important to point out that here we're talking, the Rambam's case here, we're talking about a non-Jew. Talking about Pharaoh. So from this it follows that when a non-Jew does tshuva, he avoids punishment. when I have said this to people who have some knowledge, they say, well, of course, Rabbi, what about Nineveh? Kosh Baruch Hu sends Yonah, the prophet, the city of Nineveh, and he announces publicly in 30 days Nineveh is going to be overturned because of the evil of the city. And they all do a spectacular tshuva, and the city is saved. So the idea that tshuva applies to non-Jews as a way of avoiding punishment definitely applies. All right, let's leave that point at that, and then we have to realize that tshuva has that ability, and there's a lot of literature on the efficacy of tshuva, and that Kosh Baruch Hu, it's one of the 7 things that were created before the creation of the world, because although the world is set up in such a way that it is almost inevitable, I'm playing with various Meforshim here, almost inevitable that people will fail, it doesn't mean that you leave the world with a less than perfect record. Because when you do tshuva, you can cleanse the record. So that the failure doesn't have to weigh like an albatross around your neck, that you're weighed down by your failures and impossible to escape them. Because through tshuva, you do, in fact, escape those failures. So, and he brings examples of just easy to say what I wrote here. Yeah, okay. Now, there is another type of verse which the Rambam says is not relevant to this issue of having sinned with your own free will and thereby losing the ability to do tshuva. And that's where the prophet complains that you, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, has set up conditions for the Jewish people which will promote false excuses that they may use to claim that they're not really responsible for what they do. So, for example, the prophet says, you're condemning them to exile, and they're going to live among Goyim, and the Goyim are going to be powerful and wealthy, and they're going to have control over them, and they're going to feel abandoned by you, and it's going to look as if you don't care, and that appearance that they are living under then influences them falsely, illogically, but influences them to draw the conclusion that the HaKadosh Baruch Hu doesn't really care about them, and the HaKadosh Baruch Hu has really abandoned them, and that all the way through he didn't have a commitment to them, and that's why they failed in Eretz Yisrael. That's why they were pushed into exile, all because HaKadosh Baruch Hu set up the conditions that way. Or, for example, in Yirmiyahu, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says the prophet, tell the Jewish people, you behave as if I divorced you. As if now that you're in exile, you have no responsibilities, because the responsibility, the relationship between us has been severed. Eza krisos yesh imachem. Show me the get that I gave you, the divorce document. Where does it say that I abandoned you? Where does it say that I've cut the relationship with you? It's not true. So much so that we're learning now about the Mishkan, the Kruvim, the angels on the cover of the Aron Kodesh, the Ark, the 2 golden statues of angels. The tradition tells us that when circumstances varied, they had different postures. They could stand back to back, face to face. And when the Babylonians came in to the Holy of Holies, conquering and the burden and destroyed the temple, they were embracing one another. So, commentator says, embracing one another? What do you mean? This was a symbol of what? Love of Hakadosh Baruch Hu for the Jewish people, and solidarity and sharing and so forth and so on. The Goyim are destroying the temple. They're going into exile. And some of them explain that the vision that they were being given is a vision of hugging goodbye. Now, when you love someone and you're going to be separated from someone, you give that person a hug. That hug isn't, I'll never see you again. That hug is, I'll miss you. I'm looking forward to being back together again. That's what the hug of love was supposed to communicate. So, but the prophet complains to HaKadosh Baruch Hu, this is what they're going to say. This is what they're going to hear. This is how they're going to misinterpret what's going on. And they're going to forswear responsibility for their own failures. So this isn't where the prophet is complaining, you really took away their free will, and then we have to explain why it would be that HaKadosh Baruch Hu took away their free will. No, the prophet is explaining their false, incorrect impression and the way they'll rationalize with it. And he's asking HaKadosh Baruch Hu to do something to prevent that rationalization. So that kind of verse has nothing to do with the circumstances that we're talking about. We're talking about verses which appear to really deny the existence of free will and how they would be justified in terms of our commitment to free will. And finally, the Rambam here raises an issue. He says, I wasn't going to talk about it, but for the sake of the completeness of the discussion, I'm going to talk about it. Very, very difficult issue. And for the sake of completeness, I'm going to raise it, and we'll sort of skim it, because he put it in. He talks about it in the Mishnah Torah, and by implication, he talks about it in the Moreh Nevuchim as well. And that's the idea of HaKadosh Baruch Hu's knowledge. In particular, that he knows the future. And when you take into account the idea that he knows the future, those who want to believe that people don't have free will, that they are forced to either disobey or disobey the commands of the Torah, and that man has no free will, none at all, and everything he does is only due to HaKadosh Baruch Hu's will, because he says as follows: I'll give you a choice. Does HaKadosh Baruch Hu know before the person behaves whether he'll be righteous or wicked, or does he not know? You choose. It's got to be one or the other. Either HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows or he doesn't know. If you say that he knows, then it follows from that he will be forced to do that which HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows. Why? Why would HaKadosh Baruch Hu's knowing force him to do what HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows? Because if he knows, if HaKadosh Baruch Hu does know, I'm sorry, the syntax is so right. Either he's forced to do what HaKadosh Baruch Hu knows he's going to do, Or you're going to tell me that his knowledge isn't perfect. His knowledge is fallible. And if you tell me his knowledge isn't perfect, then all sorts of terrible things follow about the weakness of the Creator, and they're totally unacceptable. So notice the way the Rambam puts it here. It's a very subtle, and the Mishnah Torah says a little bit more than this. Does he know or doesn't he know? If he knows, then he's got to do what Kodesh Baruch Hu knows. And if he doesn't have to do it, then his knowledge isn't perfect. So Kodesh Baruch Hu's knowledge being perfect means that he must do what Kodesh Baruch Hu knows. Why? How do you get from knowledge to being forced to do something? If I know what you do, even if I know what you will do, I'm I and you're you. My knowledge is in my head. Why would my knowledge in my head force you to do something? I'm outside of you and I know things. We're not now talking about a Kodesh Baruch Hu decreeing, causing, forcing, pushing. We're talking about his knowing. So the way he explains it is as follows. Let's suppose that yesterday Kodesh Baruch Hu knows that today I do A. Now, don't think about my doing A. How did I do A? Where did I get the energy from? Did somebody pay the bills? Will the electricity be on? Are my muscles going to work? Don't think about that. That's not the issue. The issue is, could I do anything else? Do I have any other options? Well, if you tell me that my will is under my control, if you tell me that I'm the one who's making the decision, yeah, I do A. That's what's in the history book. Really, I do A on today. But if it's my decision and I'm the one who's determining the outcome, then there must be at least one other thing that I could have done that I didn't do. And that's why I wasn't forced, because I had an alternative. But now, says the Rambam, if you picture me as really having an alternative, I do A. That's what's in the history books. That's what happens. A is what happens. But B was there as an option. It's just that I choose A. I don't choose B. Right? How then do you understand Kodesh Baruch Hu yesterday, knowing I'll do A? If B's an option, it's up to me. If I could do B if I want, wouldn't that mean that it was under my control to make God's knowledge yesterday false? Because yesterday he knows I do A. And if I choose to do B, then his knowledge is going to be wrong. Wow. That sounds a little, august. I can determine whether God's knowledge is right or wrong. It's up to me. I push the button, God makes a mistake. That does sound a little grandiose. So if you agree that God's knowledge yesterday is absolute, perfect, infallible, it comes out that today, when I do A, B really wasn't an option. If B really wasn't an option, then there was only one thing on the table. There weren't any other alternatives. If there weren't any other alternatives, then there wasn't anything else I could do. And if there wasn't anything else I could do, then I must do this, because there isn't any other alternative. So insisting that Kodesh Baruch Hu's knowledge is perfect deprives me of the alternative. It deprives me of B. Saying that God knows yesterday, I'll do A today, doesn't mean that he's pushing, forcing, imposing on me A. No, he's not interacting with me at all. It's just that knowing yesterday that A is what's going to happen means there's nothing else that could happen. Oh, but then I'm stuck. I'm stuck because there's nothing else that can happen. I'm stuck because the alternative is cut off. That's the way that Rambam is structuring the argument. So, assuming he knows, and really knows absolutely, there's no alternative, my will is fixed. There's nothing else I can do. And then free will is an illusion. That's what the critic says. Are we clear? Okay, it's very important because people get mixed up about this. They want to put God's knowledge and divine providence into the picture together and make a kind of chulent. He doesn't only know what he's doing, and he's doing, he is making it happen, and therefore you are forced and you are pushed. All that is interesting, and maybe you'll find it someplace else, but the Rambam never says anything like that. His problem is knowledge, just knowledge. And the way he treats it is problem of just knowledge. So it's not a question of pushing or forcing, it's a question of taking away the alternative. Now, the Rambam says he has here a certain idea from what we would call theology, knowledge of the divine, and it's difficult and it's subtle and it's complicated, and I want to just skim it and hint at it and correct some misimpressions that are common. The Rambam starts with the idea that God is one, absolutely one, not compound, complex, built out of elements in any sense whatsoever. And that being the case, he says, in particular, God can't have attributes. Because once you start talking about God's attributes, properties, qualities, there's a whole bunch of them. God is omniscient, all-powerful, all-knowing. God is omnipotent, all-powerful. God is righteous, tzaddik, and he's merciful, and he's kind and magnanimous, and on and on and on and on. So we're not going to tolerate the idea that there are many qualities that he has. One way of putting this is that the things that we say God does, he doesn't do them through powers, because those powers would be qualities that he has. So, for example, we're not going to say God knows because he has knowledge. There's God, and there's knowledge, and God possesses the knowledge, and because he possesses the knowledge, he knows various things. Then there's God and his knowledge, and they're two different things. And that can't be. And he brings a very interesting proof in the Hebrew language that if you want to say the life of so-and-so, what's called a smichus in Hebrew, the word for life is chai or chayim, and to say the life of so-and-so, you use the smichus form chai. So when Moses wants to enforce what he says by referring to the life of Pharaoh, he says, chai Paro, the life of Paro. You never have that with respect to Kodesh Baruch Hu. Never. That construct form. Because the construct form would mean there's God, and this is life, and this is the life that he has, and then you have God and his life, and it's two things. It says, Chai Hashem. Chai means life, Hashem, which would mean, if anything, they're the same. Not there are two, and one possesses the other. So the Rambam says that, in some sense, Kodesh Baruch Hu is identical to what you would want to call his qualities. He's really identical to them. And then there aren't two. If A and B are identical, there's only one thing. It just has two names. Now, the idea of God being identical to his qualities, and in particular, God being identical to his knowledge, says the Rambam, that's a mouthful. For a human being, the idea of a person and his knowledge are really two very distinct things. For example, almost all the knowledge you have, you acquired. Some of it when you were 6, and some of it when you were 26. But that means there was you before the knowledge and you after the knowledge. So it can't be identical to the knowledge because you went from not having it to having it, and you didn't change who you are. You didn't change your identity. You just picked up something you didn't have before, like buying a new coat. So you can't be identical to the knowledge anymore than you could be identical to your coat. So if you want to say that HaKadosh Baruch Hu is identical to his knowledge, you're saying something which we, find it very difficult to deal with intellectually. Now, he makes a remark here. Again, this remark is very widely misunderstood. He says, one way to put the uniqueness of HaKadosh Baruch Hu is that when you think about knowledge, there's really three different things that you think about. There's the content of the knowledge, the fact or the proposition that's known, and there's the faculty of the human being by which he knows that fact, and then there's the event or state of being of knowing it. Sometimes you have the faculty and you don't have the knowledge. Sometimes you forget the knowledge. These things change. But when you have the knowledge, the faculty of knowing and the content known and the state of the person having that content, having the knowing, are three things, all of which ultimately reduce to the same thing. This feature, that all three of them are the same, has nothing to do with theology. It has nothing to do with the Creator. This is something which the philosophers in his time said about knowledge, of human knowledge. The knower, meaning the faculty of knowledge, faculty of intellect, and the known, the thing that's possessed, and the knowing, the being in possession of it, are all the same. That's a fact about knowledge wherever you find knowledge. What's unique about the Kodesh Baruch Hu is that he is the faculty of knowing, and he is the thing known, and he is the knowing. Not that the three are the same, but that he's identical to all three of them. That's what's unique about the Kodesh Baruch Hu. People get confused and think that the analysis of knowledge into three features which coincide is something that's unique only to the divine. That's not correct. Knowledge, having three features that coincide, is a definition of what knowledge is. But in the case of Kodesh Baruch Hu, since he's identical to these qualities, he's got to be identical to all three. That you don't have with the human being. Human being is not identical to his intellect. Human being is not identical to the things that he knows. Human being is not identical to his knowing. Those things are transient in a human being. At any rate, what he wants to get from this is that our understanding of the way the divine works means that our normal way of describing these things is off limits. Our normal way of describing them, our normal concepts that we use to describe them, is off limits. And the only way that you can generate the problem here is if you pretend you understand what it means to say that God knows. And you could only pretend you understood what it means to say that God knows if you assimilated God's knowledge to our knowledge. There's Reuven knows and God knows. Okay, God's knowledge is superior. It's more it has bigger extent and greater depth and greater accuracy. But knowledge is knowledge, and it doesn't make any difference whether it's Reuven or whether it's God. That's incorrect. That's incorrect. When we speak about God's knowing, we can't mean what we mean when we talk about human beings, because the nature of the divine is such it doesn't tolerate the kinds of descriptions we give for human beings. And that's being the case, we have to confess we don't really understand what it means to say that God knows. And if we don't understand what it means to say God knows, we also can't deduce that there's a problem for free will. The deduction of the problem for free will is only because we think we understand. We assimilate it to a human concept which we understand and use its content to reason about it and arrive at the conclusion that there's no alternative, and there's no alternative, therefore you couldn't have done anything else. All that's based on pretending you understand what God's knowledge is. Once you realize that you don't understand what God's knowledge is, that reasoning goes by the board. That's roughly what he wants to say about foreknowledge of free will. You have a question?
Yes. The knower I thought when that says the knower, I would think it would mean the person who's knowing, but the Rav said something different. The knower is the person possesses. Is a knower? The knower, the concept of a principle of a knower is a possession or something.
You know, we talk like this, and there's something fairly deep going on here. Did you sign the check? Yeah, I signed the check. Really, I think I only noticed your fingers moving. What do you mean you signed the check? Only your fingers were moving. Your feet weren't moving. Your head wasn't moving. Your shoulders weren't moving. Only your fingers. What do you mean you signed the check? I mean, see, that's how I do it. I sign the check by moving my fingers. That's how I do it. You're right. Only my fingers are moving. That's correct. But that's how I, the person, sign the check. I sign it by moving my fingers. And I say, you know. Does your left shoulder know? Does your left shoulder participate in the knowing? If a person had his left shoulder amputated, would it be impossible for him to know? My left shoulder. Okay, come on, you know. To say I know means my intellect has grasped the thing. I know with my intellect. I don't know with my left shoulder. So when you talk about the knower, that's like saying who signed the check. But it doesn't explain how the check got signed and what part of the body or the faculties of the person are involved in signing the check. Your toes aren't involved in signing the check. So when you say that the knower here, it doesn't mean the name of the person who knows. It means the quality in him that produces the knowledge. And the quality in him that produces the knowledge is the intellect. And now, the intellect is understood as something which moves from potential to actual regularly. As you all know, when you learn something new, before you learned it, you had the potential to know it, and now you really know it. So something changed. Before you didn't know it, now you do. So the intellect went from a potentiality to an actuality of knowing. The knowing is a state of the intellect. And the content known is the intellect in that state. It's not something else, because knowing isn't like putting on a jacket where, you know, the person and the jacket are two different things. And then the knower, which is the activated intellect, and the known thing, which is the content, the state that the intellect is in, and the knowing is the being in that state. All of it's one thing. That's roughly the way they look at it. So it's really the activity of the intellect that's at stake there. I'm not pretending that I fully understand this. This is medieval and ancient philosophy, and I didn't major in those things. I read them on the outside. I read them in the Rambam as well. But that's roughly the idea that's being said. And again, none of this has anything to do with theology or with the divine. In the case of the divine, what's unique is that you've got A, B, and C, and we're being told that A, B, and C coincide with one another. And with respect to the divine, the creator is the A, and the creator is the B, and the creator is the C, and none of those things we understand. That's what's unique about theology, not the fact that the A and the B and the C coincide. That's something which applies to general philosophy in terms of understanding what knowledge is.
The knowing is the action of the intellect, like the intellect doing its thing.
You see, let's talk about knowing square. So, square is an idea. And knowing it means possessing it mentally. Now, a square isn't like a donut that you can put in a box. What would it mean that the intellect knows square? The square is an idea, and the intellect is what has ideas. The intellect is a thing which ideas are an expression of. So it's the intellect in the state of the idea of square, that is the knowing of square, and it is the idea known of square, and its being in that state is the knowing of the idea of square. It's all one thing. There's just the intellect in that state.
Wouldn't the known also be that?
Yes, that's what we said. The knower and the known and the knowing. All three are the same.
So then, it can't be this. We're separate, obviously, different ideas. They're obviously, when it comes to a person, there's different ideas. When it comes to Kadosh Baruch Hu, they're the same. But when it comes to a person,
No.
they're different ideas.
Well, I don't see why you say that.
No? Because we're obviously making some sort of differentiation between them all.
Oh, that doesn't matter. The fact that we make a differentiation doesn't mean they're not the same. Consider a triangle, okay? A triangle is one concept. Now, what about a trilateral? A closed, three-sided, plane figure. Is that a different thing? If you think about it, you'll realize that every triangle has three sides and they join together and it's a plane figure. And if you think about it, you realize that if it has three sides and it joins together and it's a plane figure, it'll have three angles. So being a triangle and being a trilateral are really the same thing, even though the words and concepts are different, but the thing is the same thing. The fact that you have different words just means you have different ways of getting at the same idea. But once you analyze it, you see that the idea is the same idea. I'm not pretending that I'm succeeding in explaining all of the details of this, But that's roughly what the Rambam talks about here. So that's his way of dealing with it. I've done this at great length in my lectures on free will. Okay, yeah.
That means that we are the same in the sense as what is the differentiation between us and the Kadosh Baruch Hu? If this is in applying to us, this is one idea, and applying to Kadosh Baruch Hu, it's one idea. What's the
difference is that in the case of Kadosh Baruch Hu, not only are the knower, the knowing, and the known the same, but he is identical with the whole of that. He, the whole of him, his entire essence is identical with that. And that's not true for any human being. Right? Knowledge is just one of your faculties. You have many other faculties, and your knowledge comes and goes. It increases and decreases, and you stay the same. You're not identical to any of them. These are just features of you. The crucial part of the theology is that he is identical to his qualities. He, in toto, is identical to his qualities. You're not identical to your knowledge. There's much more to you than just your knowledge. And your knowledge changes and you don't. Well, for me, this has been an absolutely wonderful series. I hope it's been enlightening for you and for the people who are viewing. And tomorrow, Mitzvah Hashem, I'm going to start a series, practical reasoning, the kind of reasoning that we go through in everyday life, as applied in particular to Torah subjects, matters of religion in general and Torah in particular. And I just want to make a 2-minute introduction. Now. I get emails from time to time. The person writes, I appreciate the way you think and the way you explain things and the fact that you use logic to try to analyze things. How can I train my logic? How can I become more logical? What books should I read about becoming more logical? What would help me to do things in a more logical way? I think this is unfortunately, it's a mistake. Let me give you an analogy. Somebody says, listen, I'm into motion, and I want to move fast. Train me to move fast. So I say, well, how are you planning to move? And he says, I'm planning to run, to swim, and to ski. Train me to be fast. So, listen, I'm sorry, but training you to ski fast won't help you run fast. It just won't help. It requires different types of coordination and endurance and different types of training. Neither of them is going to be very good for swimming. There isn't one way of being fast. There's being a fast runner and being a fast skier and being a fast swimmer. Aristotle said this 2,300 years ago. Different disciplines have different methods. And there's no one way to just learn to be logical. There's a different type of logical analysis or different type of logical techniques that are relevant to different types of disciplines. And it's a little bit like swimming. You got to jump in and practice them and learn some tricks and break your head on some difficult problems. And in that way, you can improve your skills piecemeal. If you'll have people who'll tell you science is the only method of truth, and scientific method is the only way to investigate, that's the only way to arrive at reality, and the scientific method is to observe the world, and then to see things that happen, and then to try to figure out why they happen, and you create a theory with which you could hopefully explain why it happens, and then you think, well, but maybe the theory is true, maybe it's false, so you do a test, and you figure out an experiment, you do the experiment, and you observe the experiment, and if it works well, you think of another experiment. If it doesn't work well, then you go back and you change the theory. That's the scientific method. That's how you get knowledge about the real world. And nothing else counts. Everything else is just fantasy. Really. Well, let me ask you a question, Sir Scientist. Do you believe in math? Mathematics. Do you use mathematics in your science? You do. Where'd you get all that math from? I learned it from a math book. Yeah, and where did he learn it from? Did he observe the world and see things that happen and try to figure out how they happen and then create a theory to explain it and then do an experiment? Is that where the math came from? No, it isn't actually. What he did was he sat down and he thought, I wonder if prime numbers go on forever or they don't. Let's think about it. Oh, let's see. If they stop, and then lower ones, and these are divisible, and those are divisible, and if I use the factorial, so you can't go below that, and then you get a contradiction. So I guess they go on forever. No theories, no experiments, no observations, no nothing, just think about it. So maybe what you call a scientific method isn't the only way to get at the real world, the real facts about the world. And then once you loosen up your dogmatism a little bit, you think, well, should astronomy and biology be done the same way? In particular, you can't really do experiments in the heavens, can you? You can hope for observations, but you can't do experiments. In biology, you can do experiments. Oh, so some do have and some don't have. And then what about history, where the thing is 1,000 years old and you can't repeat it at all? You can't even observe it anymore. Oh, history. So I guess there has to be a different way of doing it. That's right. Each one has its own way of doing it. Each one has its own type of method. And each one has to be learned by experience separately. I can testify that when I first got into Gemara, the fact that I was trained in philosophy of mathematics retarded my understanding of Gemara for 5 years. Because I was stuck on my method, and it's a wrong method for Gemara. Gemara has its own method. So what I hope to do over the next few weeks is to take you through standard types of reasoning which are very widely applicable, and in particular they're applicable to debates in philosophy, about religion, about Torah, and show you something about how they work, so as to sharpen up your skills and to show you some applications which might be useful for you. Because a book with a royal road is just not in the offing. It's not something that's possible.
Thank you.
Okay.